The cruelest thing about power is how easily it mistakes silence for worthlessness. The champagne glasses clinked beneath a ceiling 30 feet high while a live jazz band played soft enough to sound expensive. Rain slid slowly down the eastern glass wall of Whitmore Tower, turning the city lights of downtown Chicago into long streaks of gold and white. Nearly 300 guests filled the marble lobby in tailored tuxedos and diamond necklaces, their laughter echoing beneath the steel arches that had already made the building famous before it officially opened. Reporters stood near the entrance with cameras raised. Investors shook hands beside a scale model of the 72-story skyscraper sitting under crystal spotlights at the center of the room. Daniel Whitmore loved every second of it. The 51-year-old CEO moved through the gala with the confidence of a man who believed the skyline itself belonged to him. Every few feet, another mayor, investor, or television host stopped him to congratulate him on the $900 million project. "A masterpiece," one architect said. Daniel smiled without slowing down. That's what happens when vision meets discipline. Then the music stuttered for half a second. Not enough for most people to notice. But Naomi Brooks noticed. She was kneeling near the west corridor, quietly wiping rainwater footprints from the black marble floor with a folded towel tucked beside a gray janitor's cart. Her uniform sleeves were rolled neatly to her elbows. A faded security badge hung from her neck. Most guests never looked directly at her. Some stepped around her like she was part of the furniture. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward the giant glass walls surrounding the lobby. Her expression changed. The rain outside had shifted direction. Wind. Stronger now. She stood carefully, ignoring the ache in her lower back, and looked toward the illuminated steel model at the center of the room. Something about the structure felt wrong. The vibration came again. Tiny. Almost invisible. But Naomi heard it the same way a musician hears a wrong note in a symphony. She walked quietly toward the model, weaving past waiters carrying trays of champagne. The closer she moved, the tighter her face became. Her fingers brushed the edge of the miniature eastern facade. The steel beneath the display trembled faintly. Naomi's breathing slowed. "No," she whispered under her breath. At that exact moment Daniel turned and saw her standing beside the model in her janitor uniform. His smile disappeared instantly. Several investors followed his gaze. One woman frowned as Naomi leaned closer to inspect the structure. Daniel walked toward her, irritation already rising in his face. "Excuse me," he said sharply. Naomi looked up calmly. "Sir, the East Side residents, don't touch that." Conversations nearby began to quiet down. Naomi glanced once more toward the glass walls where rain hammered harder now. "You need to clear the rooftop level," she said carefully. "The wind load is shifting against the modified support system." Daniel stared at her for a second like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because he was embarrassed she had spoken at all. "Get the black janitor away from my investors," he said loudly enough for half the lobby to hear. A few uncomfortable chuckles spread through the crowd. Someone near the bar shook their head with a smirk. Naomi stood perfectly still while two security guards started toward her. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks and lowered his voice just enough to sound controlled. "You clean floors here," he said. "That's all." Naomi looked directly at him, unshaken. Around them, cameras continued flashing while thunder rolled faintly beyond the glass walls 70 stories above the city. Then the building vibrated again. This time strong enough for the champagne inside several glasses to ripple. For a moment nobody moved. The ripple inside the champagne glasses disappeared almost as quickly as it had come, and nervous laughter drifted back into the lobby as guests convinced themselves it had been nothing more than thunder. Daniel Whitmore straightened his suit jacket and gave the room a polished smile meant to erase the awkwardness. "Chicago weather," he said casually. A few investors laughed with relief. The jazz band resumed playing. Security stopped a few feet from Naomi, waiting for Daniel to signal whether they should remove her. Naomi lowered her eyes first, not out of fear, but exhaustion. She quietly stepped away from the glowing model and returned to her janitor cart without another word. To the guests around her, it looked like defeat. But Naomi was listening. Beneath the polished marble floor, beneath the expensive music and the conversations about stock prices and skyline awards, the building carried sound differently now. Steel under pressure always did. She could hear it in the faint humming hidden inside the walls. 23 years earlier, Naomi had learned that sound inside a drafting studio at Howard University. Back then, professors used to say she could read structural tension the way pianists read notes on sheet music. She had been 21 years old, brilliant, relentless, one of the youngest architectural scholarship finalists in Illinois. Her sketches had once covered entire studio walls. Curved glass concepts. Wind-resistant load systems. Sunlight studies drawn in charcoal and blue pencil until 3 in the morning while the rest of campus slept. But talent had never protected her from grief. Naomi pushed her cart toward the quieter service hallway near the loading elevators while guests continued celebrating only 50 feet away. Nobody noticed her disappear. That was the strange thing about invisible people. Society only saw them when it needed something cleaned. The service corridor smelled faintly of industrial soap and wet concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Naomi removed her gloves slowly and rubbed the stiffness from her fingers. The vibration came again. Slightly stronger this time. She closed her eyes. East side load transfer. Somewhere above the 60th floor. Her breathing tightened. They changed the support sequence, she whispered. Years ago, Whitmore Development had purchased one of her unfinished structural concepts through a third-party design firm after she vanished from the industry. By then Naomi no longer fought for credit. Hospital bills and funeral costs had swallowed every piece of the life she used to know. After her 12-year-old son Marcus died in a construction accident caused by ignored safety violations, architecture stopped feeling like art to her. Buildings became reminders. She walked away from the profession before anyone noticed she was gone. Or maybe they noticed and simply moved on. Corporations always did. Naomi opened the small locker assigned to her at the end of the corridor. Inside sat neatly folded cleaning towels, an old thermos, and a worn leather notebook held together by fading elastic bands. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it carefully. Inside were hand-drawn structural calculations, original facade curvature measurements, and wind distribution sketches dated nearly 11 years earlier. Her handwriting filled every margin. Naomi flipped directly to the Eastern support pages. The numbers matched the vibration she felt through the floor. Her eyes stopped on one sentence written beside the original design. If support sequencing changes, harmonic resonance may amplify during crosswinds above 70 miles per hour. Outside, thunder rolled louder against the glass tower. Naomi looked toward the ceiling as another low vibration moved through the steel beams overhead like a distant heartbeat. Then somewhere far above the lobby, guests began applauding as rooftop fireworks preparations started early. Daniel Whitmore hated unpredictability. That was why every inch of Whitmore Tower had been designed to communicate control. The lighting inside the lobby adjusted automatically every 12 minutes to maintain what consultants called executive warmth. The marble imported from Italy had been polished until it reflected shoes like dark water. Even the jazz band had signed contracts limiting the volume of applause between songs so investors could continue private conversations without interruption. Daniel believed power lived in details. That belief had built his empire. At least that was what magazines liked to print beside photographs of him standing in front of glass buildings with his arms crossed. But the truth was simpler. Daniel understood how to make wealthy people feel safe investing money beside other wealthy people. He understood image better than empathy. Outside the tower, rain swept harder across the Chicago skyline while wind pushed low clouds between the neighboring buildings. Near the rooftop ballroom 70 floors above the streets, workers finished preparing the midnight fireworks display as guests gathered beside the panoramic glass walls to take photographs of the city. Daniel stepped into a private elevator with 3 investors and a television reporter following close behind him. "The rooftop presentation starts in 10 minutes, his assistant said while checking her tablet. Daniel nodded once. "Make sure the mayor gets seated near the east side windows." "Of course." As the elevator climbed, the reporter smiled. "People are already calling this the future of American architecture." Daniel adjusted his cufflinks again. "The future belongs to people willing to build it." He enjoyed saying things like that because they sounded profound without revealing anything real. The elevator opened into the rooftop ballroom where crystal chandeliers reflected against towering glass panels stretching nearly 40 feet high. Guests wandered beneath soft golden lighting while servers carried silver trays through the crowd. A string quartet replaced the jazz band upstairs. Everything felt elevated. Refined. Expensive enough to separate people from ordinary life for one evening. Daniel walked slowly through the room greeting investors by name. Every conversation revolved around expansion, acquisition, profit margins, and influence. Nobody discussed families. Nobody discussed grief. Wealthy rooms often avoided human things. Near the far end of the ballroom, Daniel paused beside the eastern glass wall overlooking Lake Michigan. The wind outside pressed rain diagonally against the massive transparent panels. One investor raised an eyebrow. "You sure these windows can handle this storm?" Daniel smirked. "These windows can survive hurricane force pressure." He tapped the glass lightly with confidence. But almost immediately afterward, a faint metallic hum moved beneath the floor. So subtle most guests ignored it. Daniel did not. His expression changed for less than a second before disappearing. Beneath another polished smile. "Probably the wind dampeners adjusting," he said casually. Yet even as he continued speaking, his eyes drifted toward the eastern support columns running along the ballroom perimeter. Down below in the service corridor, Naomi moved quickly now. Her janitor cart rattled softly over concrete flooring as she headed toward the restricted maintenance elevators. Every instinct inside her told her the modified support sequence was failing under the storm pressure. She remembered the original calculations perfectly because she had once spent 8 straight nights refining them after Marcus fell asleep beside her drafting table as a little boy. He used to draw skyscrapers with crayons while she worked. "Buildings should feel alive," he once told her. Naomi still remembered smiling at that. The memory tightened painfully inside her chest as she pressed the maintenance elevator button repeatedly. Upstairs, thunder cracked loud enough to shake several glasses across the ballroom tables. This time guests noticed. Conversations paused. A woman near the windows looked uneasy. Daniel lifted his champagne flute and forced another calm smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced confidently, "welcome to the crown jewel of Chicago." Then the eastern glass wall released a low groaning sound that rolled across the ballroom like distant steel bending somewhere deep inside the storm. Daniel Whitmore hated unpredictability. That was why every inch of Whitmore Tower had been designed to communicate control. The lighting inside the lobby adjusted automatically every 12 minutes to maintain what consultants called executive warmth. The marble imported from Italy had been polished until it reflected shoes like dark water. Even the jazz band had signed contracts limiting the volume of applause between songs so investors could continue private conversations without interruption. Daniel believed power lived in details. That belief had built his empire. At least that was what magazines liked to print beside photographs of him standing in front of glass buildings with his arms crossed. But the truth was simpler. Daniel understood how to make wealthy people feel safe investing money beside other wealthy people. He understood image better than empathy. Outside the tower, rain swept harder across the Chicago skyline while wind pushed low clouds between the neighboring buildings. Near the rooftop ballroom 70 floors above the streets, workers finished preparing the midnight fireworks display as guests gathered beside the panoramic glass walls to take photographs of the city. Daniel stepped into a private elevator with 3 investors and a television reporter following close behind him. "The rooftop presentation starts in 10 minutes, his assistant said while checking her tablet. Daniel nodded once. "Make sure the mayor gets seated near the east side windows." "Of course." As the elevator climbed, the reporter smiled. "People are already calling this the future of American architecture." Daniel adjusted his cufflinks again. "The future belongs to people willing to build it." He enjoyed saying things like that because they sounded profound without revealing anything real. The elevator opened into the rooftop ballroom where crystal chandeliers reflected against towering glass panels stretching nearly 40 feet high. Guests wandered beneath soft golden lighting while servers carried silver trays through the crowd. A string quartet replaced the jazz band upstairs. Everything felt elevated. Refined. Expensive enough to separate people from ordinary life for one evening. Daniel walked slowly through the room greeting investors by name. Every conversation revolved around expansion, acquisition, profit margins, and influence. Nobody discussed families. Nobody discussed grief. Wealthy rooms often avoided human things. Near the far end of the ballroom, Daniel paused beside the eastern glass wall overlooking Lake Michigan. The wind outside pressed rain diagonally against the massive transparent panels. One investor raised an eyebrow. "You sure these windows can handle this storm?" Daniel smirked. "These windows can survive hurricane force pressure." He tapped the glass lightly with confidence. But almost immediately afterward, a faint metallic hum moved beneath the floor. So subtle most guests ignored it. Daniel did not. His expression changed for less than a second before disappearing beneath another polished smile. "Probably the wind dampeners adjusting," he said casually. Yet even as he continued speaking, his eyes drifted toward the eastern support columns running along the ballroom perimeter. Down below in the service corridor, Naomi moved quickly now. Her janitor cart rattled softly over concrete flooring as she headed toward the restricted maintenance elevators. Every instinct inside her told her the modified support sequence was failing under the storm pressure. She remembered the original calculations perfectly because she had once spent 8 straight nights refining them after Marcus fell asleep beside her drafting table as a little boy. He used to draw skyscrapers with crayons while she worked. "Buildings should feel alive," he once told her. Naomi still remembered smiling at that. The memory tightened painfully inside her chest as she pressed the maintenance elevator button repeatedly. Upstairs, thunder cracked loud enough to shake several glasses across the ballroom tables. This time guests noticed. Conversations paused. A woman near the windows looked uneasy. Daniel lifted his champagne flute and forced another calm smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced confidently, "welcome to the crown jewel of Chicago." Then the eastern glass wall released a low groaning sound that rolled across the ballroom like distant steel bending somewhere deep inside the storm. The ballroom froze beneath the sound of bending steel. For one terrible second, nobody spoke. The rain outside roared across the glass walls while the chandeliers overhead trembled gently, scattering reflections of gold light across frightened faces. Several guests backed away from the eastern side of the room, their polished shoes scraping nervously against the marble floor. A champagne flute tipped over near the bar and rolled in a slow circle before falling silent. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless beside the towering windows, staring at the steel beams above as if confidence alone could hold the building together. The arrogance that had carried him through the entire evening suddenly looked fragile beneath. The pale light washing across his face. Richard Hale continued flipping through Naomi's notebook with shaking hands. Every page contained calculations detailed enough that only the original structural designer could have written them. Wind load distributions. Harmonic dampening ratios. Emergency stabilization protocols. His breathing became shallow. These formulas, he whispered. These are the original foundation calculations. Naomi looked toward the eastern support columns again. The vibration had shifted frequency. Worse now. Faster. The rooftop occupancy is amplifying the pressure transfer, she said quietly. You need to shut down the upper level immediately. Daniel finally turned toward her fully. The anger in his face was still there, but now fear moved underneath it. Not fear of embarrassment. Real fear. The kind powerful people rarely experience because money usually protects them from consequences before consequences arrive. You are telling me this entire building is unstable, he demanded. Naomi shook her head once. No. I am telling you the building is trying to survive a mistake. Another deep groan echoed through the eastern wall. This time several guests gasped openly. One couple hurried toward the elevators while others began pulling out their phones, whispering anxiously. The expensive atmosphere of the gala was collapsing into panic inch by inch. Daniel looked toward Richard desperately. Fix it. Richard swallowed hard. If what she is saying is true, the modified support sequencing changed the harmonic response. Daniel's voice sharpened instantly. Can you stabilize it or not? Richard hesitated too long. Naomi already knew the answer. She stepped toward the massive glass windows slowly, studying the movement hidden within the reflections of rain and city light. Most people saw beauty when they looked at skyscrapers. Naomi saw stress lines. Pressure. Invisible forces pulling against one another. Buildings spoke constantly. Most humans simply never learned how to listen. Thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline again, softer now but heavier somehow. The storm clouds had darkened the lake until the horizon disappeared completely into blackness. Naomi placed her hand lightly against one of the eastern support columns. Cold steel vibrated beneath her fingertips like a heartbeat struggling to steady itself. The sensation pulled an old memory into her chest without warning. Marcus standing beside her drafting table at age 8, holding a blue crayon in his small hand. How do buildings stay standing, he had asked. Naomi remembered smiling as she answered him. Because every piece holds the others up. The memory nearly broke her for a second. She closed her eyes briefly, forcing herself back into the present. Around her, wealthy strangers whispered nervously while security guards waited for instructions they did not understand. Daniel watched Naomi carefully now, confusion replacing superiority for the first time since the night began. He could not reconcile the woman he humiliated downstairs with the calm certainty standing before him now. Naomi slowly opened her eyes and looked toward the far service corridor leading into the restricted mechanical levels. There is still time, she said quietly. But somebody has to manually recalibrate the east side harmonic dampeners before the pressure spreads into the upper facade anchors. Richard stared at her. The control system is locked behind maintenance clearance. Naomi met his eyes calmly. I know. Then she started walking toward the dark service hallway while the sound of rain and trembling steel followed her through the silence. Naomi's footsteps echoed softly through the narrow maintenance corridor while alarms still had not sounded upstairs. That was the terrifying thing about expensive disasters. Buildings like Whitmore Tower were designed to hide panic until the last possible second. The walls remained polished. The lights stayed warm. Music still drifted faintly through hidden speakers while steel groaned behind perfect architecture. Naomi moved quickly beneath rows of exposed pipes and electrical conduits, her janitor shoes slipping slightly against the concrete floor slick with condensation. Behind her, Richard Hale struggled to keep pace. Wait, he called breathlessly. How do you even know where the harmonic control room is? Naomi did not slow down. Because I designed the emergency access layout before your company changed it. Richard stopped walking for half a second. What? Naomi pushed through a heavy steel maintenance door at the end of the corridor. The mechanical chamber beyond hummed with deep electrical vibration. Screens flickered across the walls displaying structural pressure data in red and amber lines. Rain hammered somewhere above them like thousands of fingertips against glass. Naomi moved straight toward the central control console without hesitation. Her eyes scanned the pressure readings instantly. The east side load transfer had exceeded safe fluctuation limits by nearly 18%. Worse than she expected. Richard stared at the monitors in disbelief. "Oh my God." Naomi's voice stayed calm. The rooftop crowd shifted too much weight toward the eastern observation deck during the storm. Richard looked at her again, confusion overwhelming his fear now. "Who are you?" Naomi rested both hands lightly against the control panel. For a moment she did not answer. The cold blue monitor light reflected across her face while the mechanical vibrations traveled through the floor beneath them. She looked less like a janitor standing there and more like someone finally returning to a language they once spoke fluently. 11 years ago, she said quietly, Whitmore Development purchased a structural design package through an outside architectural firm after my son died. Richard's face slowly drained of color. Naomi tapped a sequence into the console. Most of the original lead architects never knew where the concepts came from because my name was removed during acquisition. Richard swallowed hard. Naomi Brooks, he suddenly remembered the signature hidden inside the notebook. The calculations. The drafting marks. The initials stamped onto old archived blueprints he once studied during early construction planning. Naomi Brooks had been something close to a legend among younger structural engineers years ago. Brilliant. Innovative. Then suddenly gone from the industry without explanation. Richard stared at the woman beside him wearing a janitor badge and damp gray work uniform. "You are the original designer," he whispered. Naomi finally looked at him directly. "I was." Above them another low vibration rolled through the steel framework. Dust drifted softly from one of the overhead beams. Richard's panic returned instantly. "Can you stabilize it?" Naomi turned back toward the control systems. "Maybe." Upstairs in the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore stood surrounded by frightened investors while security quietly began guiding guests away from the eastern windows. The elegant confidence of the gala had vanished completely now. People no longer cared about skyline views or billion-dollar partnerships. They only cared about the sounds inside the walls. Daniel stared toward the service hallway Naomi disappeared into minutes earlier. Every instinct in him resisted what he was beginning to understand. The woman he humiliated downstairs. The janitor he dismissed in front of his investors. She knew more about his building than anyone in the room. Maybe more than him. Richard suddenly spoke through the emergency radio clipped to his jacket. His voice shook. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to hear this." Daniel grabbed the radio immediately. "Tell me you fixed it." Silence filled the line for one long second before Richard answered quietly. "The woman you tried to remove tonight." Another metallic groan rolled through the tower. Richard inhaled sharply. "She designed the entire east side structural system." The ballroom went completely silent. Silence spread across the ballroom heavier than the storm itself. The guests standing beneath the crystal chandeliers looked at Daniel Whitmore differently now. Not with admiration. With uncertainty. The billionaire who had spent the entire evening speaking about vision and legacy suddenly appeared small against the towering glass walls of the building he barely understood. Rain continued sliding down the eastern windows in silver streams while the steel framework released another deep vibration beneath the floor. Daniel tightened his grip on the emergency radio. "Richard," he said carefully, almost unable to force the words out, "tell me she can stop this." Down in the mechanical control room, Naomi studied the pressure data racing across the monitors. The east side harmonic response had nearly reached critical amplification. She moved across the console with calm precision, adjusting load balancing sequences and manually rerouting the dampening systems one by one. Richard watched her hands move across the controls like muscle memory returning after years of silence. The automatic stabilizers were altered during construction, Naomi said quietly. They prioritized aesthetics over structural rhythm. Richard looked stunned. Who approved that? Naomi did not answer immediately. She already knew. In buildings like this, beauty was often chosen over caution because caution did not photograph well in magazines. Above them, the ballroom lights flickered again. Daniel's voice cracked through the radio. Naomi. She paused at the sound of him finally using her name. The mechanical room hummed softly around her while storm water rattled through the pipes overhead. What? She answered calmly. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. Can you save the building? Naomi looked down at the structural readings. The building is not the problem. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Those words landed harder than any public humiliation ever could. Around him, investors whispered nervously while security escorted guests toward the safer western corridors. Nobody looked at him with envy anymore. Power disappeared quickly when fear entered the room. Naomi adjusted the final stabilizer sequence and watched the pressure readings begin slowing inch by inch. The violent harmonic spikes gradually softened across the monitors. The tower still groaned beneath the storm, but now the rhythm sounded steadier. Stronger. Like a heartbeat recovering after panic. Richard exhaled shakily. You did it. Naomi remained silent for a moment, staring at the glowing pressure graphs. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the dark monitor screens. Older now. Tired. Invisible for years. Yet somehow still standing inside the bones of a building she once dreamed would inspire people. Richard looked at her carefully. Why did you come back tonight after the way he treated you? Naomi's eyes drifted toward the vibrating steel walls surrounding them. Because innocent people were upstairs. Simple. No bitterness. No revenge. Just truth. Richard lowered his eyes in shame. Upstairs, the vibrations finally began fading beneath the ballroom floor. Guests noticed it immediately. The chandeliers steadied. The terrifying groaning inside the eastern glass wall softened into silence. Nervous conversations slowly returned across the room. Daniel stood motionless near the windows, staring at his own reflection in the rain-covered glass. For the first time in years, he saw himself clearly. Not as a visionary. Not as a billionaire. Just a man who had looked directly at greatness and dismissed it because it wore a janitor uniform and dark skin. Minutes later the maintenance doors opened behind him. Naomi stepped quietly back into the ballroom beside Richard Hale. Her gray uniform sleeves were still damp. Her janitor badge still hung from her neck. But the room reacted differently now. The same people who ignored her earlier stepped aside instinctively as she walked past them. Daniel turned slowly toward her. His face carried none of the arrogance from before. Only exhaustion and shame. The storm outside continued washing across the glass skyline while silence spread once more through the ballroom. Daniel took one slow step toward Naomi. You saved everyone in this building tonight, he said quietly. Naomi met his eyes calmly. No, she answered. I just listened when the building asked for help. 1 week later, the storm clouds were gone. Morning sunlight poured across downtown Chicago in long golden reflections, turning the glass surface of Whitmore Tower into something softer than power. The city moved below in its usual rhythm of traffic lights, train horns, and hurried footsteps, but inside the tower the atmosphere had changed in ways nobody could fully explain. Workers spoke quieter now when they walked through the eastern corridors. Engineers double-checked calculations that once would have been approved without hesitation. Even the security guards nodded respectfully when they passed the maintenance levels. Some lessons settled into buildings long after the noise ended. Naomi Brooks stepped through the front entrance just after sunrise carrying a small leather portfolio beneath her arm. She no longer pushed a janitor cart. The gray uniform was gone, replaced by a simple navy coat and low black heels that clicked softly against the marble floor. The same lobby that had once looked through her now seemed almost uncertain in her presence. Morning light streamed through the towering glass walls she had designed years ago, warming the polished floor beneath her feet. Naomi paused near the center of the lobby and looked upward. The steel arches curved overhead exactly the way she first sketched them on tracing paper beside Marcus while he colored little blue windows with crayons. For the first time in years, the memory did not hurt quite as sharply. Near the reception desk, workers quietly installed a new brushed bronze plaque beside the architectural display model. Naomi noticed it immediately but did not walk closer yet. She simply stood there listening to the soft hum of the building around her. Stable now. Balanced. Alive. You still listen to it. Daniel Whitmore's voice came quietly from behind her. Naomi turned slowly. Daniel stood several feet away holding 2 paper coffee cups in his hands. There was no expensive audience around him now. No reporters. No investors. Just a tired man in a dark coat who looked older than he had 1 week earlier. He walked toward her carefully and offered one of the coffees. Naomi accepted it with a small nod. Steam rose between them in the morning light. For a moment neither spoke. Daniel looked toward the eastern glass wall where sunlight spilled across the steel framework. I spent 15 years believing I built this tower, he admitted quietly. Turns out I only owned it. Naomi wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. Buildings do not care about ego, she said softly. Daniel gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. I humiliated you in front of everyone. Naomi looked at him calmly. Yes. Daniel lowered his eyes for a second. And you still saved us. Silence settled gently between them, not awkward this time. Honest. Around them, employees crossed the lobby quietly, while sunlight continued sliding higher through the glass walls. Naomi finally walked toward the bronze plaque near the architectural model. Daniel followed a few steps behind. The plaque reflected the morning light brightly enough that for a moment it almost looked like gold. Lead structural designer, Naomi Brooks. Naomi stared at the letters without speaking. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the polished bronze beside Marcus's old initials engraved discreetly beneath the dedication line at her request. MB Daniel noticed them immediately but said nothing. Some grief deserved silence instead of questions. Naomi reached out slowly and touched the cool metal surface with her fingertips. The building around her no longer sounded wounded. No hidden strain inside the walls. No desperate vibration beneath the floor. Just steady strength holding itself together against the skyline. Behind her, Daniel remained quietly still. No speeches. No excuses left. Only understanding arriving too late to erase what happened, but not too late to change what came next. Outside, the city continued waking beneath the rising sun while Whitmore Tower stood tall above the streets, carried not by pride or money, but by the unseen hands of the woman everyone once overlooked.